The night before my daughter's wedding, her future mother-in-law looked her up and down like she was something scraped off a shoe. "She'll never fit into our family," Diane said, loud enough for the whole rehearsal dinner to hear. Her son Marcus smirked. "She has nothing to offer us anyway." The room went quiet, waiting for my daughter to cry, to apologize, to shrink. Instead, Claire reached into her bag and set a plain manila folder on the table. The family's lawyer picked it up, skimmed the first page, and started laughing so hard he had to set down his wine glass. "Oh," he said, wiping his eyes, "this is priceless." Diane's smile didn't survive the next 10 seconds. "My name is Margaret Ellis. I'm 61 years old, and for most of my life, I've believed that dignity is quieter than people expect it to be. It doesn't shout, it doesn't perform, it simply waits for the right moment to be understood. That belief was tested more than once raising my daughter alone, but nothing tested it quite like the year she fell in love with James Whitfield. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Whitfield family's country club, the kind of place with cream tablecloths so stiff they crackled and chandeliers that made everyone's jewelry look more expensive than it was. I remember the smell of lilies on the tables, sweet and a little too heavy, mixing with the scent of roasted lamb drifting in from the kitchen. I remember the low murmur of 40 guests, most of them Whitfield relatives and business associates I'd never met, all dressed like they'd stepped out of a catalog for people who'd never worried about a light bill. I sat near the end of the head table, close enough to watch my daughter, but far enough to feel, as I always did, at these Whitfield gatherings, like a guest who'd wandered in from the wrong party. Claire sat beside James, radiant in a soft blue dress, her dark hair pinned back the way she used to wear it for piano recitals as a little girl. She looked calm. She always looked calm, even when I knew, underneath, something in her was bracing. I'd learned to watch for it, the tiny stillness that came over her shoulders whenever Diane Whitfield entered a room. Diane had a way of making an entrance feel like an inspection. That night, she wore emerald green, diamonds at her throat, and an expression that suggested she'd already decided how the evening would go. "Margaret," she said to me, air kissing somewhere near my cheek, "so glad you could make it. Was the drive terribly long from your side of town?" She asked it every time. My side of town, as if geography were a moral failing. "Not too bad," I said, smiling the way you smile at people you've stopped expecting kindness from. Dinner passed the way these dinners always did. Glasses raised, toasts made, Diane finding small ways to remind the room whose family this really belonged to. She toasted to the Whitfield legacy continuing, and I noticed she didn't once say Claire's name. James caught my eye once, an apologetic flicker, gone as quickly as it came. He was a good man in most ways, but good men can still be quiet in rooms where their mothers are loud. It was near the end of dinner, when the plates had been cleared and coffee was being poured, that Diane stood, tapping her glass with a spoon, the way she did when she wanted the room's full attention. "I just want to say," she began, her voice carrying easily across the tables, "that James has always known what he wanted, even as a boy, and I trust that whatever life he chooses will only make this family stronger. It should have ended there. It didn't." She turned, just slightly, toward Claire. "Of course marriage is about more than love. It's about fit, about what someone brings to a family like ours." Her eyes moved over Claire's dress, her hands, her posture, cataloging her the way you'd assess a used car. "I do hope, dear, you understand what you're stepping into." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through a few of the Whitfield cousins. Marcus, James's older brother, leaned back in his chair with the lazy confidence of a man who'd never once been told no. "Come on, Mom, let's be honest," he said, loud enough that pretending not to hear was no longer an option. "She'll never really fit into this family." He looked at Claire, almost bored. "She has nothing to offer us anyway." I felt my chest tighten, that old, familiar heat rising in my throat. The urge to stand, to defend her, to say something sharp enough to leave a mark. I'd spent 30 years defending my daughter, but before I could move, I felt Claire's hand rest lightly on my forearm under the table. Not gripping, just steady. A silent don't. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even set down her coffee cup right away. She simply looked at Diane, then at Marcus, with an expression I recognized from her childhood. The same calm she'd worn the day a teacher told her she wasn't college material. The same calm she'd worn the day her father left and never called again. "That's all right," Claire said quietly. "You don't have to take my word for it." She reached into the leather bag at her feet, the same bag she carried to depositions. I would later learn, though I didn't know that yet, and pulled out a plain manila folder. She set it in the center of the table, right next to the untouched wedding cake samples, and slid it toward the family's longtime attorney, a silver-haired man named Harold Pierce, who'd been quietly nursing a scotch 3 seats down. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "I think you should take a look at this before dessert." He opened it more out of politeness than curiosity. I watched his eyes move down the first page, then stop, then go back up to the top and read it again. The room, which had been buzzing with the aftershocks of Marcus's insult, went very quiet. Harold Pierce set down his scotch entirely. He looked up at Claire, then at Diane, then back down at the folder, and he started to laugh. Not politely, not the kind of laugh you offer to fill silence, but a real, helpless laugh that made him press the back of his hand to his mouth. "Oh," he said, shaking his head, wiping the corner of his eye. "This is priceless." Diane's smile, the one she'd worn all evening like armor, faltered for the very first time. To understand why my daughter could sit at that table and stay so calm, you have to understand what came before it. You have to go back almost 30 years, to a small rental house on Delancey Street, with a leaking roof and a landlord who never answered his phone. Claire's father left when she was 4. He didn't leave loudly. No slammed doors, no dramatic speech. He simply stopped coming home one Tuesday, and after 2 weeks of silence, I understood he wasn't going to. I found out later there'd been another woman, a job transfer to Ohio he'd never mentioned, a whole second life he'd been quietly building while I stayed home folding onesies and reading bedtime stories. I won't pretend it didn't break something in me. It did. But grief, I learned, has an expiration date if you let it. Responsibility doesn't. I took a job at the hospital billing office during the day and cleaned offices 3 nights a week after Claire went to sleep, paying a teenage neighbor $5 an hour to sit in the living room and listen for her. I remember counting coins on the kitchen table some months just to make sure we had enough for both rent and her school shoes. I remember the particular exhaustion of coming home at 11 at night, smelling like industrial floor cleaner, checking on her sleeping face, and thinking, this is temporary, this has to be temporary, even on the nights I wasn't sure I believed it. Claire was a quiet child, watchful in a way that sometimes worried her teachers. She noticed things other children didn't, the tightness in my shoulders after a long shift, the months I skipped buying myself anything new so she could have a winter coat that fit. She never asked for more than we had. If anything, she asked for less, as if she'd already learned, at 7 years old, that wanting things out loud only made the wanting hurt more. I used to tell her, on the nights I had the energy for it, we don't have much, but we have enough, and we have each other, and nobody can take either of those away from you. She'd nod, solemn as a little judge, and tuck the words away somewhere I think she carried for the rest of her life. She was smart in a way that showed up early and never let up, the kind of smart that terrified some of her teachers because it came with questions they didn't always have answers for. By high school, she was the girl staying after class to argue with her economics teacher about interest rates, the girl who read law journals for fun while other kids read magazines. A guidance counselor once told me, not unkindly, "Your daughter thinks like an attorney already. She just needs the paperwork to catch up to her." I didn't fully understand what he meant until years later. Money for college wasn't something I had. I'd saved what I could, but what I could amounted to a few $1,000s. Nowhere near enough for the kind of school Claire's grades qualified her for. I remember sitting with her at the kitchen table, the acceptance letters spread out like a losing hand of cards, and telling her, "We'll figure it out. We always figure it out." She looked at the numbers for a long time, then folded the letters closed with a steadiness that scared me a little. "I'll get the scholarships," she said, "and I'll work. I don't need it to be easy. I just need it to be possible." And she did exactly that. 3 jobs some semesters, tutoring, a work-study position in the financial aid office of all places, and weekend shifts at a coffee shop near campus. She graduated with honors and almost no debt, a fact she still mentions with quiet pride, the way other people might mention a marathon they ran. Law school came after 2 years of working full-time to save for it, because she refused, on principle, to take out loans she wasn't certain she could repay quickly. "I watched you count coins for rent, Mom," she told me once. "I'm not doing that to my own kids someday." By the time she finished, she'd specialized in something most people glaze over hearing about at parties: corporate financial restructuring, the unglamorous, unseen work of untangling companies from the debt that was slowly strangling them. She was good at it. Genuinely, quietly excellent, in the way people are when they've spent their whole lives learning to notice what others overlook. I tell you all of this not to make her sound like a saint, because she wasn't one. She could be stubborn, and slow to let people in, and fiercely private about her own struggles in a way that sometimes worried me. I tell you this because I want you to understand what Diane Whitfield was looking at that night at the rehearsal dinner, and what she couldn't see at all. She saw a modest dress, a mother who drove an old sedan, a young woman with no family name attached to a wing of a hospital or a university library. She didn't see 30 years of discipline. She didn't see a girl who'd built herself, brick by brick, out of exhaustion and stubbornness, and a mother's late-night promises. She didn't see the woman my daughter had become, someone who didn't need anyone's permission to know her own worth, because she'd spent her whole life proving it to herself first. Diane thought she was looking at someone who had nothing to offer. She had no idea what she was about to find out. Claire met James Whitfield on a Tuesday afternoon in March, in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a downtown law firm, of all unremarkable places for a love story to begin. She was 3 years into her career by then, working for a boutique firm that specialized in corporate restructuring, and James was there representing his family's company, Whitfield Textiles, in an unrelated contract dispute that had nothing to do with her at all. She'd simply been the associate sent to retrieve a set of documents from the wrong meeting room, and he'd been the one to notice her hands were full and hold the door. "That's it?" I asked her when she first told me the story over dinner. "He held a door? He held a door, and he didn't try to make conversation about it," she said, smiling into her wine glass. "You'd be surprised how rare that is. James Whitfield, I'll say plainly, was not his mother. He was easy in a way. Diane never was, quick to laugh at himself, uninterested in the performance of wealth even though he'd been raised inside it. He asked Claire questions and actually listened to the answers, which she told me, more than once, felt like a foreign language after years of dating men who talked mostly about themselves. Within a few months, she was happier than I'd seen her in years, the kind of happy that made her call me on Tuesdays just to talk, for no reason at all, the way she hadn't done since she was a teenager. I met James for the first time at a diner near my house. His idea, not Claire's. He'd asked specifically to meet somewhere I'd be comfortable, rather than somewhere he thought would impress me. I remember thinking, watching him fold his tall frame into the cracked vinyl booth and order the same meatloaf special I always got, that maybe this one would be different. Maybe my daughter had found someone who saw her plainly, the way I did, without needing to measure her against anything. I was right about him. I was wrong about how easy it would be to belong to his family. The first time Claire brought him to meet me properly, a Sunday dinner, nothing fancy, just roast chicken and the good tablecloth. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought while we washed dishes, that his mother had asked a lot of questions about her background. "What kind of questions?" I asked. "Where I grew up? What my father does? Whether I went to boarding school." Claire shrugged, drying a plate with more focus than the task required. I don't think she liked my answers. I didn't think much of it at the time. Every mother has opinions about the person dating her son. I'd have had my own, had our roles been reversed. But the questions didn't stop, and they didn't stay curious for long. Claire began mentioning small things after every visit to the Whitfield estate, comments dressed up as jokes, jokes dressed up as concern. At an engagement dinner, 8 months into the relationship, Diane had asked Claire, in front of a table of Whitfield family friends, whether she'd always known she wanted to marry up, delivered with a smile bright enough to make the insult look accidental to anyone not paying close attention. Claire had laughed it off in the moment. She told me about it 3 days later, in the careful, offhand way she told me most things that actually hurt her. "She's just protective of James," Claire said. "It's not really about me." I wanted to believe that too, for her sake. But I'd raised a daughter who noticed everything, and I'd spent enough years being underestimated myself to recognize the particular flavor of condescension Diane was serving. It wasn't protectiveness. It was appraisal, the quiet, persistent sizing up of someone Diane had already decided didn't measure up, delivered slowly enough that objecting to any single comment would make Claire look thin-skinned rather than Diane look cruel. Marcus, James's older brother, was less subtle about it from the start. He ran a portion of the family textile business and carried himself with the particular swagger of a man who'd never once had to build anything from nothing. At a holiday gathering that December, I watched him ask Claire, with a smirk he clearly thought was charming, "So what exactly do you do again?" "Something with paperwork?" "Corporate restructuring," Claire said evenly. "I help companies that are in financial trouble find a way through it." "Sounds thrilling," Marcus said, already turning to refill his glass, the dismissal so complete it barely qualified as an insult. It was simply erasure. James, to his credit, pulled Claire aside later that night and apologized on his brother's behalf, the way he always did, quietly, sincerely, and utterly without power to actually change anything. "They'll come around," he told her, more than once, the way people say things they want to be true, more than things they know to be true. "Once they really get to know you." I remember asking Claire, around this time, why she kept going back. To the dinners, the holidays, the slow drip of small humiliations dressed up as manners. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything, before answering. "Because I love James," she said. "And because I refuse to let people like Diane decide what I'm worth, just because they said it first." She paused, something steady settling into her expression. "I've spent my whole life proving people wrong quietly, Mom. I'm not going to stop now." I didn't know then exactly what shape that quiet proof would eventually take. Neither, I suspect, did Diane. But something had already been set in motion, months before that rehearsal dinner, in a part of my daughter's professional life she hadn't mentioned to any of us yet. A case file, crossing her desk, with a name on it that would have made Diane Whitfield's blood run cold, had she only known to ask. The humiliations, once they started in earnest, arrived with a rhythm of their own, never frequent enough to justify an ultimatum, never mild enough to fully forget. I've come to believe that's a particular skill some people cultivate, the art of cruelty measured out in doses small enough to be denied. By the spring after their engagement, Claire had stopped telling me about most of it. I only learned the fuller picture much later, piecing it together from things she let slip and things James eventually admitted himself, ashamed. There was the wedding registry Diane had helped update, without asking, quietly removing several items Claire and James had chosen together, and replacing them with china patterns from a store Claire had never set foot in. There was the seating chart for the engagement party, where Claire's co-workers had been placed at a table near the kitchen doors, while distant Whitfield cousins occupied seats of honor. There was the comment, overheard by a bridesmaid, and relayed to Claire almost gleefully, that Diane had made to a friend at her country club. James could have done so much better for himself, but I suppose love makes people blind. Claire absorbed each of these the way she'd absorbed every slight of her childhood, quietly, without visible cracking, filing it away somewhere I imagined she'd learned to keep separate from the part of herself that still, stubbornly, hoped things might change. The engagement party itself brought a new low. Diane had stood to give a toast, glass raised, and spoken at length about the Whitfield family's history. 3 generations of textile manufacturing, a grandfather who'd built the company from a single mill, values passed down like an heirloom. It was, on its surface, a lovely speech. She ended it by turning to Claire with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And I do hope," she said, "that you'll come to understand what it means to carry a name like ours. It's not something you're simply handed. It has to be earned." The room applauded politely. Claire smiled and raised her glass along with everyone else. I watched her hand, steady around the stem of the flute, and thought of all the times I'd watched that same hand steady itself over the years, signing a lease she wasn't sure she could afford, gripping a diploma she'd worked 3 jobs to earn, holding mine at her father's funeral, a man who'd left us and still somehow left a hole when he died. It was around this time, though I didn't know it then, that Claire's firm assigned her to a new case. A mid-sized textile manufacturer, based 2 states over, struggling under a mountain of debt from an ill-advised factory expansion and a series of bad loans taken out during a leadership transition. The client's name, at first, meant nothing to me when she mentioned it in passing over the phone. Whitfield Textiles Group. I didn't connect it, not immediately, to James's family. Claire had mentioned once that the company operated under several subsidiary names, and restructuring work, by its nature, often came through referrals and holding companies, rather than a name you'd recognize from a wedding invitation. Claire told me later that she almost recused herself the moment she saw the connection clearly in the file. It would have been the easy thing to do, the comfortable thing. Step back, let another associate take the case, keep her professional life separate from the family she was marrying into. But 2 facts stopped her. First, professional ethics required her only to disclose a potential conflict to her firm and to the client, not necessarily to withdraw, provided both parties consented to her continued involvement, and the Whitfields, notably, engaged with the firm entirely through their outside general counsel, never learning which specific attorney had been assigned to the workout. Second, and more simply, the company was in genuine, serious trouble, closer to collapse than any of them apparently realized, and Claire was, by every measure her firm could offer, the best person available to save it. "I told myself it was just work," she said to me, months afterward, once everything had already come to light. "I told myself I'd never use it against them. I just wanted to do my job well, the way I always have." She paused, something rawer showing through her usual composure. "I didn't go looking for power over them, Mom. It just happened to be sitting on my desk." Over the following months, she worked the case the way she worked everything, thoroughly, quietly, at odd hours after long days, poring over loan documents and cash flow statements long after James had gone to sleep beside her. She discovered, in the course of that work, things about Marcus's management of the company's southern division that would have alarmed any outside auditor. Decisions that had accelerated the very debt crisis the family was now scrambling to survive. She never mentioned any of it at Sunday dinners. She sat through Diane's comments about fitting in and Marcus's dismissive jokes about her paperwork career, while holding, in a locked drawer at her office, the single most consequential document in the entire Whitfield family's financial future. I think about that irony often. The woman they'd decided had nothing to offer was, at that very moment, the only person standing between their family legacy and its collapse. She never once threw it in their faces. Not during the worst of Diane's comments, not during Marcus's laziest cruelties. She simply kept doing her job, kept loving James as steadily as she'd loved anything in her life, and waited, the way she'd always waited, patient and unhurried, for the moment when the truth would no longer need her defense to be understood. That moment arrived on the night before her wedding, at a table set with cream linens and lilies, when Diane Whitfield decided, one final time, to tell my daughter exactly what she was worth. The room was still holding its breath when Harold Pierce set down his scotch glass entirely and turned back to the first page of the folder, reading it a second time as if he didn't trust himself the first time through. "Harold?" Diane said, her voice carrying an edge now, the pleasantness starting to fray at its seams. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his laughter fading into something more careful, more focused. The room had gone quiet enough that I could hear the ice settling in someone's water glass 3 seats down. "Diane," he finally said, "did you know Whitfield Textiles has been in an active restructuring process with outside counsel since January?" Diane blinked. "What are you talking about?" "Marcus handles all of that with the bank. The bank referred it out months ago," Harold said, "to a firm handling the workout. You signed the engagement letter yourself, through general counsel. I have the letterhead right here." He turned the folder around so she could see it, and I watched the color drain slowly from her face as she recognized her own signature at the bottom of a page she clearly hadn't read closely enough. Claire spoke then, calm as still water. "The firm assigned me to the case in February," she said. "I've been the lead attorney managing your loan restructuring for the last 5 months." The words landed like a stone dropped into a pond, the ripples spreading outward across every face at that table. Marcus's smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by something closer to alarm. That's not possible," he said. "We'd have known. Someone would have told us who." "You engaged the firm, not me specifically," Claire said. "Cases are assigned internally. I disclosed the connection to my supervising partner the day I saw your family's name on the file, and to your general counsel, as ethics required. Both approved my continued involvement, since you'd never dealt directly with any single associate before. Nobody lied to you, Marcus. Nobody had to. You simply never asked." Diane's hand had gone to her throat, fingers pressed against the diamonds there, as if she could steady herself through them. This is a conflict of interest," she said, grasping. "You should have recused yourself immediately." "I offered to," Claire said. "Your counsel declined, in writing, twice, because I was, by their own words, doing excellent work on an extremely difficult file. Your Southern Division's cash flow position is worse than anyone in this family seems to understand. I've spent the last 5 months trying to keep Whitfield Textiles from defaulting on its senior loan by December." Harold Pierce, still holding the folder, looked up at Diane with an expression somewhere between disbelief and something almost like respect. "She's not exaggerating," he said quietly. "I've seen the preliminary numbers. Without the restructuring plan she's built, the bank would have called the loan in already. This," he tapped the folder, "is the only thing standing between this family and losing the company their grandfather built." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence before it. It wasn't the silence of an audience waiting for a punchline. It was the silence of people recalculating everything they thought they understood, all at once, in front of 40 witnesses. Diane looked at Claire, really looked at her, I think, for the first time in the 18 months they'd known each other, and something in her composure finally cracked. "You've known this whole time," she said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "All those dinners, all those—" She stopped herself, unable to finish the sentence, unwilling to say the word insults out loud in front of her own guests. "Yes," Claire said simply. "I've known since February. Why didn't you say something?" Claire's voice, when she answered, wasn't triumphant. It wasn't even particularly cold. It was tired, in the way of someone who had carried something heavy for a long time and was only now allowed to set it down. "Because it was never my job to make you respect me by threatening you," she said. "I wanted you to see it on your own. I kept hoping you would." Marcus, to his credit, or perhaps simply to save himself, tried a different approach, the reflexive charm of a man used to talking his way out of consequences. "Look, if there's been some misunderstanding, some tension, we can absolutely work through this like adults, Claire. We're going to be family." "We are," Claire said. Which is exactly why I'm telling you now, instead of letting your lawyers find out from the bank next week. I could have said nothing. I could have let this play out exactly as it was already heading. She let that sentence sit in the air for a moment before continuing. I didn't do this to embarrass anyone. I did my job. I just think it's worth remembering. The next time someone decides they know exactly what a person has to offer, that they might not have the whole file in front of them. James, who had been sitting in stunned silence beside her through the entire exchange, finally reached over and took her hand under the table. Not the apologetic, helpless gesture I'd seen from him before, but something firmer, something that looked, for the first time, like a man choosing a side. Diane sat back down slowly, the diamonds at her throat suddenly looking less like armor than like something heavy she was being forced to carry. Harold Pierce closed the folder gently and set it back on the table, the laughter completely gone from his face now, replaced by quiet, genuine respect. Priceless, he murmured again, but this time it didn't sound like a joke at all. Nobody finished their dessert that night. The catering staff cleared plates of untouched wedding cake samples, while the Whitfield family sat in a silence none of their money could smooth over. Diane excused herself early, murmuring something about a headache that fooled no one. Marcus lingered a few minutes longer, long enough to corner James near the coat check, and hissed something I couldn't hear, though I could guess well enough at its shape from the way James's jaw tightened before he answered him, quiet and firm, in a way I'd never seen him speak to his brother before. I found Claire outside a few minutes later, standing alone near the valet stand, her arms wrapped around herself against the October chill, looking not triumphant but simply spent, the way you look after finally setting down something you've been carrying too long without complaint. "You okay?" I asked, wrapping my cardigan around her shoulders, the way I used to when she was small. She let out a breath that turned to fog in the cold air. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I thought I'd feel something bigger, vindicated, maybe. Mostly, I just feel tired." "That's allowed," I told her. "You don't owe anyone a triumphant feeling just because you were right." She almost smiled at that. "I never wanted to use it against them, Mom. Not really. I kept hoping I wouldn't have to. I kept hoping they'd just see me, without needing proof." "Some people only ever learn to see clearly when they're forced to," I said. "That's their failing, not yours." James found us there a few minutes later, still in his rehearsal suit, his tie loosened, looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in the last hour. He didn't say anything at first. He simply pulled Claire into a hug, holding on longer than the moment strictly required, and when he finally pulled back, his eyes were wet. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it, for every dinner I let slide, every comment I laughed off because it was easier than making a scene. I told myself they'd come around eventually. I should have made them come around a long time ago instead of waiting for you to have to prove something you never should have needed to prove." "You don't have to apologize for your mother's behavior," Claire said. "No," he agreed. "But I do have to apologize for mine, for staying quiet." He took her hand. "That stops tonight. Whatever happens with the wedding, whatever happens with my family, I need you to know I'm choosing you. Not the version of you my mother finds acceptable. All of you." Claire married James the next afternoon, as planned, in a small ceremony that Diane attended but did not speak at, sitting stiffly in the second row rather than the first, a small but unmistakable adjustment James had insisted on. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. There were no tearful apologies exchanged at the altar, no sudden transformation of a woman who'd spent 18 months making her disdain known. Some people don't change quickly, if they change at all, and Claire had made her peace, I think, with the possibility that Diane never fully would. What did change was smaller, but in its own way, more important. The Whitfield loan restructuring closed successfully 3 months later. The company's southern division reorganized under terms Claire had spent nearly a year building, with a level of care Marcus's own negligence had never earned him. Whitfield Textiles survived. Employees kept their jobs. A 100-year-old family legacy didn't collapse under the weight of decisions made by people who'd never bothered to understand the numbers themselves. Claire never once mentioned any of this to Marcus directly, never used it as leverage in the family dynamics that followed. She simply did the work, the same as she always had, and let the results speak in whatever language people were finally willing to hear. But Claire had never needed Diane's approval to know her own worth. She'd learned that lesson decades earlier, at a kitchen table on Delancey Street, counting coins with a mother who told her, over and over, that we have enough, and nobody can take that away from you. I think about that rehearsal dinner often, the sound of Harold Pierce's laughter turning slowly into something more solemn, the particular quality of silence that falls over a room when people are forced to recalculate everything they assumed about a person they'd already decided wasn't worth their attention. I think about how much of my daughter's strength that night came not from the folder itself, but from everything that had built her long before she ever opened it. The discipline, the patience, the refusal to let anyone else's cruelty define what she believed about herself. If you've ever sat at a table where someone decided, before they truly knew you, exactly what you had to offer, I hope you'll remember Claire. I hope you'll remember that quiet isn't the same as weak, and that the people who underestimate you rarely have the whole file in front of them. Your worth was never theirs to calculate in the first place. If this story moved you, I'd love for you to share it with someone who needs the reminder tonight, and subscribe if you'd like to walk through more stories like Claire's with us. Thank you for listening, and take good care of yourselves and each other.